One of the biggest mistakes new comic collectors make has absolutely nothing to do with grading companies, restoration, pressing, cleaning, signatures, auctions, eBay, or even picking the wrong books. The biggest mistake is much simpler than that. They start buying before they have a plan. And honestly, if you spend enough time in this hobby, you'll notice something interesting. The collectors who seem happiest 5 or 10 years later are usually not the ones who bought the most comic books. They're the ones who collected with purpose. Meanwhile, a lot of collectors end up with long boxes full of random books they barely care about. Thousands of dollars tied up in comics they never intended to own long term, and a collection that feels more accidental than intentional. And part of the reason that we're talking about this in this episode today is I continue to see new comic collectors in the Facebook, CGC forums, and Reddit and other places showing off new collections of low and mid grade stuff. I'm not being disrespectful, by the way, but they're just gobbling up books quickly, maybe not thinking it through. I've seen the cycle happen enough times. And so today I want to talk about what I believe are some of the best ways for beginners to approach comic collecting, not from the perspective of speculation or chasing trends, but from the perspective of building a collection you'll enjoy for years. And the first thing I think every collector should do is establish a goal. Now, this sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised how many people actually never do it. They buy a Spider-Man book one week and an X-Men book the next week, then a Batman key, then a random variant, then a movie spec book, that kind of thing. Something they saw on social media. And before they know it, they've spent thousands of dollars and still don't have a collection that feels complete. Because they never defined what they were actually trying to accomplish. A goal gives direction to every purchase. Maybe your goal is to own every major Spider-Man key. Maybe it's collecting first appearances of your favorite characters. Maybe it's building a complete run of a title. Maybe it's focusing entirely on Golden Age books. Maybe it's Silver Age. Maybe it's iconic covers. The point is that the specific goal doesn't matter nearly as much as having one does. Because once you know where you're going, every buying decision becomes easier. When a new book comes across your screen, you can ask a simple question. Does this help me reach my goal? If the answer is yes, then great. If the answer is no, then maybe that money is better saved for something important. And honestly, I think this is one of the biggest differences between experienced collectors and newer collectors. Experienced collectors tend to be more selective. They tend to have smaller collections, not because they like comics less. It's because they know exactly what they're doing. They know what they're trying to build. Now, once you've established a goal, the next thing I would strongly recommend is identifying your major keys as early as possible. And this is where I see a lot of beginners accidentally cost themselves money. Let's say, for example, your goal is to build a meaningful Spider-Man collection. Most collectors naturally start buying smaller books first because they're affordable. A $50 book here, a $500 book here, maybe even a $1,000 book there, right? Couple minor keys. And before long, they've spent several $1,000s without acquiring any of the books they actually wanted the most. The problem is that major keys often appreciate faster than secondary books. That's why I generally tell newer collectors not to be afraid of targeting those big books early. Because if an Amazing Fantasy 15 or ASM 1 or ASM 129 or some other major key is ultimately on your wish list anyway, waiting 5 years to buy it is just going to mean you're going to pay more. The same concept applies to Batman, Superman, X-Men, virtually every area of the hobby. The strongest books attract the strongest demand. And over long periods of time, that demand tends to matter. Now, obviously, I'm not saying everyone should run out and buy six-figure comics immediately. That's not realistic, and I'm not saying that. But I do think beginners should identify the most important books within their collecting goals and make those books a priority rather than an afterthought. Because one thing you'll notice in this hobby is that nobody ever complains about buying major keys too early. What they typically complain about is waiting. You'll hear stories constantly, collectors talking about books they almost bought or the one that got away or they should have bought this or that, books that doubled, tripled, quadrupled. The regret almost always comes from waiting, not acting. Now, another incredibly important piece of advice, and something that I don't think gets discussed nearly enough, is choosing your desired grade before you buy. And this is a huge one. Because many collectors don't actually know what they want. They just know they want the book, but that's not enough. You need to decide. You need to determine what grade will genuinely make you happy. And I think this is one of the most personal decisions in collecting. Some collectors are perfectly happy with lower grades, and that's fine. Low grades better than no. We all know the saying, right? And it's true. Others strongly prefer mid-grade examples. Some want high-grade books whenever possible. I know some collectors that have to have things in a 9.4, 9.6, period. I get it. There's no universally correct answer. The correct answer is the one that fits your budget and satisfies you. That's the correct answer. But here's the key. Figure that out before you buy it, not after. Because what often happens is a collector buys a lower grade copy because it's cheaper. Then 6 months later, they decide they actually wanted a nicer copy, so they upgrade. But then another year passed, and then they upgrade again. Now they've paid multiple transaction costs, multiple shipping costs, multiple marketplace fees, and multiple spreads between buying and selling when they could have just bought the grade they really wanted from the get-go. Now, obviously, budgets matter. Not everyone can buy the exact copy they want immediately. Okay, I understand that. But I still think it's valuable to identify your target grade. Maybe it's a CGC 4.0, maybe it's a 4 to 6.0, maybe it's a 6 to 8.0, whatever it is. You need to define it. Because having a target creates clarity, and clarity prevents expensive mistakes. Personally, I found that the happiest collectors are usually those who own books and grades they're comfortable living with long term. Not necessarily the highest grades. Not necessarily the most expensive grades either, just grades that satisfy them every time they look at the book. That's the sweet spot. Now, the final piece of advice I want to talk about is probably the most controversial. Don't buy the cheap books first. I know that's the opposite of what many people naturally want to do, but hear me out. Let's say you have a collecting goal that includes 10 major books, 2 expensive books, 3 mid-range books, and 5 relatively inexpensive books, for example. Okay? Most collectors start with the inexpensive books because they feel attainable. And psychologically, that feels productive. You feel like you're contributing to your collection. You're checking boxes, you're making progress. The collection appears to be growing, but here's the problem. While you're buying all the smaller books, the major keys are continuing to appreciate. And they usually appreciate a lot faster. I touched on this earlier in this segment, but by the time you finally decide you're ready to buy the big key, it's going to be significantly more expensive than when you first started. I've seen this happen over and over again. Collectors spend years assembling everything around the centerpiece. Then the centerpiece becomes dramatically harder to acquire. And now instead of moving closer to the goal, they've actually moved further away from it. And that's why I generally recommend working backwards. Get the difficult books first. Get the expensive books first. Get the books that will hurt the most if they double in price before you buy them. Because once those books are secured, everything else tends to become easier. The smaller books usually remain available. The bigger books are often the ones that create the most pressure over time. And honestly, this approach also changes your collecting experience psychologically. Once the major keys are safely in your collection, the hobby becomes much more relaxed. And I can tell you that from personal experience. You're not chasing the giant book hanging over your head anymore. You can enjoy filling in the supporting pieces without constantly worrying about the cornerstone getting more expensive every year. You can just kind of watch the heritage auctions go without having to, jump in. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to every rule. Markets move differently. Some books surprise people. Some books underperform and all that. Nothing is guaranteed here. But as a general strategy, prioritizing major keys early has worked extremely well for many collectors over long periods of time. So if you're new to collecting, remember these 3 things. First, establish a goal before you start spending serious money. Second, identify the grades you'll actually be happy owning and target those grades from the beginning. And third, don't buy the cheap books first. The biggest keys are often the books that appreciate the fastest, and waiting until the end to acquire them can become a very expensive mistake. Collecting comics should be fun, but having a plan makes it a lot more rewarding, a lot more efficient, and usually a lot less expensive in the long run. Thanks for listening to the Slabbed Portfolios podcast today. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any breaking news or updates. I hope this information has continued to help you, and I will see you guys on the next one.